Good morning. My name is Joan Schwartz. I'm an interviewer for the Holocaust Oral History Project of the Orange County Anti-Defamation League. Today, which is Sunday, March 12th, 1995, we are interviewing Galena Segal, a survivor of the Holocaust. Thank you very much for agreeing to give your testimony, which is a very precious gift to all of us and all future generations.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. It's an opportunity of a lifetime.
Yes, it is. All right, please tell us your full name and where and when, what year you were born.
My name is Galena Segal, and I was born on October 16, 1935, in Odessa, USSR.
All right, and tell us where Odessa is.
Odessa is located on the Black Sea, and historically it was a port of Franca. It didn't belong to any republic, to any territory. It was a free city, but later it became a part of USSR and then a part of Ukraine.
Do you happen to know what the population of Odessa was when you were a little girl?
I remember this number. Before the war, it was 600,000 people living in Odessa. After the war, it was much, much less.
And tell us about family life and whether you had any siblings and what it was like living in Odessa when you were a little girl.
I had a sister. She was Zoya Segal. She was a year and a half older, and we were two happy little girls until we were 3 and 4 years old. Our family life was normal. Our mother was a piano teacher, and we used to listen to music, and she used to take us to concerts. And we played outside, and we read books since we were very young kids. My sister learned to read when she was 4, and when I became 4, she taught me to read. So we spent a lot of time reading books for children, and we enjoyed it.
What did your father do?
My father was an accountant of a department which supplied grain to Odessa in its vicinities. He had a full-time job when I was born.
And do you have any recollection of what did you as a family celebrate the Jewish holidays? Were you aware of any Jewish life in Odessa?
I don't remember anything pertaining to Jewish life before the war. I remember we used to go to our grandparents' place, and it was matzahs on the table. But I don't remember participating in any seders or any other Jewish holidays. I remember eating umentashe because Jewish food traditionally had been eaten everywhere. Jews were deprived to practice their religion, but they didn't stop cooking in Jewish meals.
Now, what happened after the beginning of the war, after your parents heard about the beginning of the war? Did that change what they did in Odessa?
Yes. One day, on June 22nd, 1941, I remember it was announced on the radio the beginning of the war, and we were very upset, and we started getting together, collecting our necessities to leave Russia and to leave Odessa. Then we went on a train which took us to Middle Asia, to Central Asia, to Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan. My sister and I and my mother and one of my aunts went.
Where was your father?
My father had been killed before that. He had been arrested in 1937 first and disappeared. We have never heard about him since. And it was the time in Russia, it has a special name, Izhovshchina. Izhov was Stalin's accomplice who really was in charge of action to arrest the intelligent people and tops of military and kill them, destroy them. So my father didn't believe that he did anything wrong. He didn't want to hide, and despite of my mother's begging. So one night he had been arrested and vanished. But I remember him very vividly. I was 2 years old, and I remember sitting on his laps, and he fed me scrambled eggs.
So after he vanished, did your mother know what had happened to him?
No, she tried to find out. The authorities never told her what happened to him, but one of my grandmother's neighbors who worked as a guard, the prison guard, told my grandmother that he was shot on a spot execution way, along with other people who were arrested at the same time.
Did your mother find that out before you went to Tashkent?
Yes, she did. She started dating her second husband after that.
So tell me, what was it that made your mother go to Tashkent? Was it because your father was killed? I mean, your father was arrested, excuse me.
No, we had to go to Tashkent because Nazis approached Odessa, and we had to escape in order to survive. It was the beginning of the war, and the entire population tried to escape east, going east, and people who were lucky to get into cattle trains, cattle boxes. They escaped to Tashkent and other cities in Central Asia. Some people were to Ural, and not far, not too many people went to Siberia, but they escaped. The majority of people escaped.
So tell me about the trip from Odessa to Tashkent, what it was like in the cattle cars.
Mm-hmm. The trip lasted several months. For several months we lived in a cattle wagon, and we didn't have much to eat because my mother didn't take things or food supply without her. Nobody believed that the war would last longer than a few months, and we didn't have any winter clothes. So whatever we had in our suitcases, she traded for scanty food to feed us, and we lived in this cattle wagon, which became our second home for, I guess, 3 months, trying to get to Tashkent, and because the railroad were loaded with the trains carrying the evacuees, and the capacity of this railroad was very small. It was only one railroad between Moscow and China, so we had to take this railroad, and we lived in this cattle box, slept there, and just lived our life. And we were bombed very often because the Nazis used to come at night and drop bombs on the trains, carried only evacuees. It was not a military train. So it was a very frightening time.
Tell me about your recollections of how you felt when you heard the planes overhead and dropping bombs.
I was horrified. During this time at night, our mother used to cover us with her body, and we only heard screams and explosions of bombs, and my sister also screamed next to me. I was horrified. I always used to lose track of time because it lasted for a long time. And a madman who lived with us in the same cattle box would barricade the door and not let people out. And people screamed, wanted out to just hide in a ditch, but he won't let us. He was mentally sick, and he was not drafted. So somehow, when during the day we could get out for some water or food.
So what happened after you arrived at Tashkent?
We tried to find a place to live, and at this time, evacuees settled in an old part of Tashkent, and where there was no electricity or indoor plumbing. So we were able to find a place to live in a hut with no wooden floor, just on a clay floor, and 4 of us lived in this hut.
Who were the 4 people?
4 of us, my sister and I, my mother, and my aunt, who came soon after us.
And
one of the twins, her twin sister, remained in Odessa with her parents, my grandparents.
All right, and then what happened to you in Tashkent? Did you and your sister go to school, and what did your mother do?
We went to school. I went to 1st grade. My sister, who could read and count also, she was already 8 years old, and she was accepted to 2nd grade. She skipped 1st grade. My mother didn't have a job, and she stayed with us, and my aunt was sent to work on a field, and she used to steal some potatoes and beets and bring in her underwear, and we ate these vegetables. But soon my stepfather came to Odessa. He was the military school for military music school was evacuated to Odessa, and he was a teacher of this school. So he worked in Tashkent teaching kids to play wind instrument for military bands. So he had a job, but it was not paid much, and it was a little easier, but still we didn't have enough to survive.
Now, you referred to him as your stepfather. When did your mother marry him? In Tashkent or back in Odessa?
He lived with us since, I guess, since 1939. And then when he came to Odessa, they decided to marry.
To Tashkent, you
in
mean?
Tashkent, sorry. Mm-hmm. When he came to Tashkent, they decided to marry, and he adopted us, and we had carried his name, Kulik. His name was Lev Kulik.
So was your name Segal until the time that you were adopted, or you meant, what was your mother's name, and did you ever use her name?
After my father was arrested and disappeared, my mother was afraid for us to keep his name, Segal. So we had her name, Sharkansky. It was her maiden name. And so until 1941, when our stepfather adopted us, we were Sharkanskys, and then we became Kuliks. And I had this name until mid-80s, after I came to the United States, and in several years I went through an immigration procedure, to naturalization procedure. I took back my original name, Segal.
All right, and what was it like going to school in Tashkent? Did you enjoy school? Tell me a little bit about
I was
that.
very afraid. I was very scared because school kids teased us. The evacuees, they're like, I would say, kids with white skin, because they were Muslims, Uzbeks, and their parents hated Jews, so their children did. So I remember I was harassed at school, and I didn't want to go to school. But the teacher, she was a nice, very nice woman, Russian woman, so she just tried to keep us comfortable. She understood the problem. So I went to this school for 3 years and just learned basics.
Was there any sign of any anti-Semitism directed towards your mother or your stepfather?
We lived among Uzbeks. We didn't had any Russian or Jewish neighbors. We didn't know anyone. So they hated us. They didn't want to rent a place. It was a problem to find a place. Some of them, there was a family of Jewish Uzbeks, and we were able to find a place to live with them because they were Jewish too. And they lived comfortably. Occasionally, I remember they cooked their national food, plov, we call it pilav, and they treated us, and it was with lamb pilav, and it was the best thing I had ever eaten, but it didn't happen too often. We just ate bread and potatoes, and our mother, remember, baking potato pirog, and she with the potato fillings, and it was delicious.
And describe the living conditions when you moved to the place where there were the Jews in Tashkent, the Uzbek Jews that you referred to. How that differed from where you lived before?
No, only our landlords were Jewish, but the people who lived around, they were Uzbeks, they were Muslims. So they hated us too. I remember as a little girl being beaten when I was outside, and they were spitting in the water that I carried for my mother. And I remember that I was always afraid to go outside. But our mother sent us to school, just two of us, and somehow nothing had happened to us. Even we heard that Uzbeks kidnapped evacuees kids, especially girls, for their harem, to raise them for this reason.
But how about, you mentioned that you lived in one room when you first came to Tashkent. Now, when you moved, were the living conditions, or was there more than one room?
No, we always lived in one room, 4 or 5 of us, because our aunt and my stepfather, my mother, my sister, and I, we all lived in one room. We had a little narrow bed with my sister. Maybe it was no more than 2 feet wide, and we slept. We called it valet sleeping, but like on playing cards. I always had her feet by my face, and it was so narrow I couldn't turn around at night because my mother used to wrap me in a blanket, and I just stayed like this until the morning. So all my life I was dreaming about a wide bed that I could sleep by myself and have a real good night's sleep. It was very cold also at night. In the winter, it's called it a continental climate. It was very hot during summer and very cold and snowy during winter, so we didn't have enough clothing. We really suffered from cold.
Now, I don't remember whether I asked you, what year was it when you came to Tashkent?
It was 1941, and it was almost the fall of 1941. What I remember, what we use for heating the cow's droppings. We used to mix them with the straw in the summer and dry under the sun, and it was a perfect thing to use, and we had to store these things for entire winter. So one of my duties was to go on a road and pick up these droppings, and like manure actually, and bring them home. And once when I was doing it, the 2 military horses hit me. They were driving a carriage, and they just were smart horses. They didn't run over me. They just pushed me aside, and I wasn't. I mean, only had maybe scratches, and I was scared. But it was my one of my jobs, collecting fuel for the winter. And we also use this fuel, these droppings to cook, because we used to put them in an outdoor stove to cook our meals.
Sounds like
potatoes.
Sounds like life was pretty difficult for you. Your sister was older than you mentioned, and money was a problem. Did she or you do anything to try to get a little bit more money for the family? At that point in time, you were very young.
Yes, later on, my aunt found a job for all of us. It was a job at our home. We had to weave net bags, like fishnet bags, and we did it at home. We had very primitive supply, a shuttle and a little stick, and each one of us had to weave one fishnet a day, and because by the end of the month we had to make 100 or more of these nets. So we had little money for that. And I remember I was working, I was undernourished, and I was working. I didn't have even enough energy to pull the threads or to tie it, and my fingers hurt because of the thread was real rough. So sometimes if we didn't have 100 of these nets by the end of the month, we had to work at night. And I remember we working till 12 at midnight, and I was so sleepy, and my sister used to say, "Go to bed, you're still a little girl." She was just a year older. She maybe was 8. But it helped us. But we couldn't buy any fruits or vegetables which grew in abundance in Central Asia. I only remember how they looked, all these pears and melons, and they were so fragrant, and we couldn't have them because Uzbeks wouldn't share them with us. These fruits grew on their trees, so we couldn't have them.
So was the reason that they wouldn't share it, or was the reason because you didn't have enough money to buy it?
They wouldn't share. We didn't have enough money to buy, so for both reasons.
Mm-hmm. How long did you live in Tashkent?
We lived in Tashkent until spring of 1944, Odessa. We heard that Odessa was freed from Nazis in April. April the 10th. Was a national, like a holiday. Every year we celebrated it in our family and at school too. So we started preparing for the road. What I remember I was doing, I used to collect small pieces of sugar and put them in a little cardboard and dry pieces of bread, and I remembered we were starving on the way to Odessa, so I decided to make our own supply of all these dry goods that we don't starve on our way back. I was 9 years old.
And all of you went back to Odessa?
All of us went back to Odessa, yes.
Let me backtrack just a minute. When you were living in Tashkent, did your mother and your stepfather hear stories of what the Nazis were doing?
First they got a letter from someone in Odessa. I don't remember who sent them this letter, maybe their neighbors, that our grandparents and our twin aunt had been killed in Odessa. Actually, they were burned alive. All the Jewish population in this area was gathered into a big warehouse, and the doors and windows were sealed, and they burned all of them. And this, I remember when we came back, my mother went to the location where they lived, and the neighbors who survived, Russian people, Ukrainian people, told her these vivid stories, and she never stopped crying. It was a terrible thing to really live with. But when the war started, we were listening to the radio. Mostly it was information from the front about the fight and all these cities who were not abandoned, but just the Red Army had to leave them because they were backing up east first. And actually, we heard that about the atrocities which Nazis committed to the entire population and to the prisoners of war, and particularly about Jews. We didn't know much about the Jews who had been taken to the camps and lived in ghetto. This information wasn't really clear for the entire population because I guess one of Stalin's goals was to destruction of entire Jewish population. So it was not a big deal. It's for the rest of people, Russian people, but for us it was very painful thing to know. And this is when I learned that I was Jewish. And our mother used to say, "Thank God we escaped, otherwise we would have been killed too, for sure."
So what happened after you moved back to Odessa? What did your stepfather do, and your mother, and you and your sister? Did you go back to school?
We went back to school, and my stepfather found a job. He was before the war, he was a music school principal. And when he came back, he got a job in a different music school as a principal. And my mother also worked at the same school as a piano teacher. So they had full-time job. And life became a little bit easier. For us, in the beginning, for several years, they kept a large supply of flour and potatoes at home in case of possible hunger. And I remember we had to go at night to stay in a line all night in order to buy some flour. Several times we had to go every night and bring it home, bring home and go again, buy more and more because they didn't give much. It was limited to a few pounds. And so my mother started baking bread and something else, and she was afraid that the hunger would really happen again.
When you moved back to Odessa, did you go back to where your family home, or where you lived before?
No, the little apartment we lived before was actually turned into a place where the horses live. How you call them?
Stables.
The stables. Before my father was arrested, we had two rooms in one apartment. That after he was arrested, one room was taken away from us, and another family, very nice family of Russian people, came. He was a major, and they became friendly. And she occasionally babysat us, his wife. But they also escaped to Tashkent even. They were Russian. So when we went to look at this apartment, it was completely destroyed. It was not available. We were not allowed even, would not allow to live there because probably someone else would repair and live, but we were not able to do it. So my uncle found a place for us to live. It was just an apartment was located above the cafeteria, restaurant, and all the fumes and all the odors from restaurant just penetrated into our room. We lived in about 14 square meters room, and 4 of us. And in the beginning, our aunt stayed with us. Then she found a place for herself to live. So my parents and my sister and I, we lived in this room, and we had a grand piano, which my stepfather recovered after he returned back. It had been stolen, but he found it and was able to take it back. And so we didn't have any furniture in the beginning, so the parents slept on the piano. I slept under the piano, and then they was a little bed for my sister, and I still slept on the floor. They had a bed for themselves, my parents, but after all, they bought a little bed for myself and kept it in the kitchen. So I slept near the stove, a charcoal stove, and I was very happy because I had my privacy there. And this was most of our furniture. We had a table, and we did our homework at this round table. But when we had to study a lot, Russian kids do their homework for 6-8 hours sometimes a day. But when it was dinner time, we had to take our books and our belongings, and we had dinner. After dinner, we continued to do our homework.
Is your recollection that you had a happier life when you moved back to Odessa as compared to when you went to school in Tashkent?
Yes, it was much safer because we were among people like us, and there was no threat. From our neighbors. Of course, we could feel anti-Semitism in the air around, but generally anti-Semitism was inflicted by the government, because ordinary people didn't hate Jews, most of them, unless they had a personal reason for this hatred. But I remember at school, most of my teachers were anti-Semites. They didn't give Jewish kids good grades, the grades they deserved. They gave them extra work, and they, of course, would not declare why they're doing it. But I used to go home and complain, and my mother said, "Shh, don't talk about this because they are anti-Semites and we cannot do much about this." So they never stood for us.
You were still young.
I was 9 and 10, and at school I was very careful with these teachers. And I liked. We had 2 or 3 Jewish teachers, and I was very comfortable with them because they didn't treat me. They treated me like I deserved it. And other Jewish girls. It was a school for girls. We didn't have boys at school.
Now, you mentioned that any sign of anti-Semitism other than your teachers in school came from the government. Were you aware of anything that were done?
I was aware of the anti-Semitism on a higher level when my stepfather, who was the only Jew and among 6 music school principals, and he was only one who was not a member of the Communist Party, because being a Communist Party was a requirement for all principals of all schools. So somehow, because he was a very good principal and did a good job, they didn't force him to join the Communist Party. But he used to tell us that during these meetings in region committees, they were instructed not to accept Jewish talented kids or any Jewish kids as students to music school, and they were told not to hire Jewish teachers.
So how was your mother able to get a job as a piano teacher?
My mother?
Mm-hmm.
She worked, she started working in the beginning. Nobody could fire her.
But how did she get the job since she was Jewish? Was that any problem for her?
No, she got her job immediately after we returned back home. At this time, jobs were available, so they had to fill up these positions. Most of students, of teachers were Jewish, men or women, most of them whom I knew, because traditionally Jews are good musicians, and it was like, from Odessa, many talented performers and artists from Odessa became very well known in the world. So everybody wanted to teach their children because they hoped that the children would have similar career. This level of teaching was very good. But those who later on, these kids grew up and they graduated from music colleges and they wanted to get a job, but it was then impossible to get a job because they were Jews. It was later on, closer to 1950s. But Jewish teachers, they kept working.
And how long did you live in these small quarters, you and your sister, and with your parents?
I graduated from high school in 1953, and then I entered Odessa University, and in 5-6 years I graduated with a degree in math. And I left Odessa. It was impossible to live there in these conditions, so I tried to go. I went to Moscow and tried to get a permission to settle down in Moscow, but I was not able. In Russia, you cannot live where you want. You're not allowed to move from city to city. You have to have a special permission, and only this permission would be granted to those who marry a person in Moscow or Leningrad or Kiev or any other big city, or exchange apartments. So somehow I was able to buy a little place in the vicinities of Moscow, and then after several exchanges of this apartment, I found one room in Odessa with my sister and I and my son, who was born at this time. We lived, 3 of us, in one room, similar to that room where we lived after we returned from Tashkent, but the same grand piano.
But this was in Moscow?
It was in Moscow,
mm-hmm.
Yes.
Now, what happened to your sister? Did she go to university also?
She also graduated from the same university year before me, and she got a job in Novosibirsk. It was a research place, so she went there to work as a computer programmer. But she was not satisfied with her job, and she went back in late 60s. She went not back, but to Moscow, and I helped her to get a permission to live with us. So it was my apartment, but I took her as a member of the family, even before exchanges. So we completed these exchanges all together with her.
And what kind of work did you do in Moscow?
After I left Odessa, I knew how to teach children to play piano, because I'm from a family of musicians, and I had always observed my parents teaching their students, and I liked this job. And my mother would occasionally let me tutor them. So I found several lessons, and then I entered with the tremendous difficulties a region music school, first region music school. It was a college, 4-year college, and in 5 years it took me, because I had to go there at night. During the day I worked as a piano teacher at a local school. I graduated and continued working as a piano teacher.
Did you ever do anything in the field of mathematics?
In the beginning, when I moved to the Moscow region for a year, I worked as a mathematician in big, like we called it, the Bureau of Construction. It was a locomotive place. They built locomotives So it was very far from what I liked in math. And by the time I just decided to change a career. So I worked for a while, and then I at the same time, actually, I started my music education, piano, formal education.
Did you continue working, or how did you continue working after your son was born, or did you?
I was not able to work when my son was born. For 2 months before he was born, I had a paid maternity leave. So I found a little job at home. I was making plastic bags. I met one older Jewish man who was so nice, who allowed me to take a device at home so that I wouldn't have to take my son to work. So I made these plastic bags at my home, and the surplus that I had every time he allowed me to sell it. So I used to go to the market and sell to merchants these plastic bags that they could use them to put some vegetables, merchandise in these plastic bags, and it helped me a lot because my salary was very small, and they didn't pay it full. They paid maybe 70%.
And then, excuse me.
Mm-hmm. Well, my mother sent me $30 a month, 30 rubles a month, to support me, and so I was very productive in terms of, I had a lot of milk when I nursed my son. So I used to nurse 2 more children. So I actually sold my milk. Their mothers used to come every morning and get a little bottle of milk, and each one gave me 35 kopecks for this milk, and it really helped a lot too.
Was there any sign of anti-Semitism when you were living in Moscow? Were you aware of it?
Even my son, who was 2 or 3 years old, he could feel it. He complained that his nursery teacher didn't like him and gave priority to other little kids. And I went there to talk to her, and I found out by her remarks that she was an anti-Semite, and she knew that this child was a Jewish child, so she hated him for being Jewish. But anti-Semitism was in the air. From everywhere you could hear on the street, "You dirty Jew," and you couldn't say anything. And later when people started thinking about emigrating, the very popular saying was, "Hey Jew, why don't you go to Israel?" So people learned to answer, "I am going to Israel and you are staying here."
After Khrushchev came to power in the early 50s, was there any change in how the Jews were treated?
No, he came after Stalin's death in 1953, and people thought that they had more freedom to talk, but still it was very dangerous to talk because Stalin died, but KGB remained. So we heard many stories. People were arrested just for saying a political joke and vanished. But Khrushchev, he was not a smart leader. He didn't last for a long time, but so he just was forced to retire. But anti-Semitism, of course, remained there. It was historically anti-Semitism in Russia remained for centuries. Jews traditionally had been scapegoats. So the Jews in Russia were blamed for everything. Had been blamed for hunger, for lack of necessities, and they were blamed for being smart and trying to give education to their children. This is an old story.
How long did you live in, when did you start thinking about leaving Moscow, and how long did you live there?
I lived there until 79. In 1978, I applied for a visa, and I was able to obtain a fictitious invitation from Israel. Actually, it was a real invitation, which my girlfriend, who lived at this time in Israel, was able to provide for me. But it was a fictitious name of the person who invited me. So we had to memorize all this story, because when we went to Avir to apply for visas, we had to explain precisely who were this person and what was the relationship and how come they live in Israel and you live here. But we had to make up these stories, and no one would, of course, check them. So we had to stick to the story and just every time say the same story, because we had interviews with many authorities. So I was waiting for our visa for 1 year. Many people were fired; they lost their jobs just for applying for immigration. And at school, I remember stories that children of like junior high school age, they were brainwashed that their parents are betrayers and they go to Israel. So some children didn't want to emigrate, and they were taught to go back to school and report to their teachers, to the authorities, that their parents are about to emigrate. And so these children had been taken from their parents, and so their parents couldn't leave because they would lose their children otherwise.
Now, did your mother remain in Odessa the whole time you lived in Moscow?
Yes, she remained in Odessa. She was afraid to move after all this evacuation. She was afraid even to go on a train, on a plane, and so she decided to stay in Odessa and not to emigrate with us. Even I had invitation for her, for my son, and for myself. And she died in few years after we came here to Los Angeles.
So did you emigrate first to Israel?
No, all of us officially went on a plane, boarded the plane, which took us to Vienna. And then even in the airport, the Hayas authorities came and asked who wants to go to Israel, go to the right. The entire plane went to the left except one woman whose children were already in Israel, so she went. She wanted to join them. And so we settled in Vienna for a few weeks, because the majority of transmigrants, I guess, they were about to be sent to Rome to wait there for their visas, American visas already, because in Russia we had an exit visas. We needed an entry visas. But I decided to live in Austria. I had several friends, and besides that, I knew several people who were denied their permission to emigrate. So I contacted, despite of my poor language skills at this time, I contacted the Amnesty International organization, and I started writing, with the help of these people, writing articles about these people, about their destiny, about denial, that they were not granted permissions, and few people I helped them to leave the country. So this is why I decided to stay in Europe, and the organization Rav Tov, it's an Orthodox Jewish organization, was there, provided some money for us. We had $5 a day, and they paid our apartment, $5 a day per person, and we were able to eat and get some clothing and necessities. But it was a very interesting time, because first time we could talk freely. When we boarded the plane, we were told in Moscow, don't applaud, don't show signs of that you are happy because you are free, because once they told me people started applauding and screaming because of joy, and the plane turned around and took them back to Moscow, and they were never able to leave after that.
So how much time did you spend in Vienna before you came to the United States?
Exactly 1 year in a year, I decided it was time to go. My son, for an entire year, he went to Austrian school, and he learned language, and he was very happy. Kids loved him also. And then we moved to Los Angeles. We went to New York because Rostov only provided tickets to New York, and from New York we had to buy tickets on our own, and we came to Los Angeles. My sister immigrated 1 year before that, and we knew we had a distant family in California and in Nevada, so I decided we have to live go to Los Angeles and settle down there.
So what did you do when you came to Los Angeles? What kind were you able to find work?
For a couple months I was looking for a job, and then I found one job at Le Parc Hotel. It's Ashkenazi Enterprises in Los Angeles, near Melrose Avenue. I was a night cook. I worked 3 to 11 for $4.50 an hour, fixing sandwiches and cooking, and I was very happy. It was my first job. It lasted 6 months, and I didn't have a car, so I had to take 2 buses, and at night there were no buses, so I walked for 2 hours. I walked home. It was dangerous, but I didn't realize at that time it was dangerous because in Vienna we used to walk freely. No one told me don't walk at night in Los Angeles. And then I asked for 50 cents raise, and I lost this job. But I was able to collect unemployment because the social worker could prove that they exploited me. They gave me meat to cook home, briskets of meat, and they never paid overtime. So I was so angry that they fired me, so I contacted the board of certain authorities who checked that they really acted against the law, not paying overtime to all employees. So someone came and checked their records, and all these people got back their money in mail and for overtime that they were not paid. So because they had to show their punch cards. So it was my first actually act for social justice.
What did you do after that when you lost your job?
I went to the medical school to learn some English and get a profession of medical assistant and emergency room technician. And I was there for 9 months collecting unemployment. And then I couldn't get a job because experience was needed, and also conversational skills, where my conversational skills were pretty much poor. And all these positions in Russian doctors' offices had been taken. So I decided to take an LVN test, a nursing test, along with a friend of mine, and we passed this test from the very first attempt. We studied at home, and then I got a license. My first job was at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. So I worked as a floor nurse, and had to learn a lot, and was a lot of pressure. But I was very happy. It was $6.49. It was a lot of money for me. But then also they found someone whom they could pay less. So I lost this job, and then couldn't find any job. Occasionally worked for the agencies which send me on location to like a private duty nurse, or just occasional work in medical offices. And I was on and off welfare with my son. Then time came that I didn't have any job, and I wasn't able to afford my rent. So I had to move to subsidized housing, which was located at South Central LA. And for 4 years I lived in this area on 109th Street in Normandy, and it was very dangerous to live there because there was a lot of shooting all day and especially at night. Authorities from the subsidized housing told us, when you hear shooting, just drop on the floor.
And then you moved to Laguna Beach, Laguna Hills.
My relatives helped me to buy a manor, a little small apartment in Leisure World. And so I moved there. And my son, who was at that time already a Cal State LA student, he transferred to UCI, and he graduated from UCI in 1992 with 2 majors, electrical engineering and Russian language.
Now, you brought several photographs and a few artifacts. I would like you to tell us about this photograph. Who is that?
These are my grandparents, maternal grandparents, Chaim Sharkansky and Rosa Sharkansky. They had been killed. They had burned alive, as I mentioned before.
Okay. They're the ones that you mentioned were burned alive with your aunt's twin sister.
Yes.
In the city of
Odessa, in vicinities of city of Odessa. This little place was called Shuvalova.
And your mother heard about that by receiving a letter from someone?
Yes, in Tashkent we found out that what happened to them. And my aunt, whose twin sister was died also, she fell apart. She couldn't do anything. She kept crying all days long for several months, just grieving for her sister and for her parents.
All right, now tell us about these 2 photographs.
The photograph on the left is, on the photograph is my father. He's about 8, I guess, and he was the student of gymnasium. They had uniform and their backpack and their lunch bag, and it was, I guess, might be 1913.
And this is your father
it's
also?
My father, who was a student at this time. He went to Romania to study, and so after he graduated from college in Bucharest, he came back. One of the reasons he was arrested, that he had been accused of being a Romanian spy, because he knew the language. He spent several years in Romania. It's my family.
And so you really don't have very many pictures of your father, because he was, you found out that he was shot. That must have been very devastating.
Of course, because we had to, we had to escape in a hurry from Odessa, and I know that we had more pictures but we left all of them locked in our apartment, which was destroyed and looted. Actually, we couldn't find any belongings.
Now, tell us about this picture.
So, my father standing, and my mother is holding us, and my sister her head is by my mother's head, and I with the white ribbon, I guess. I'm sitting below her, and I am probably a year and a half or 2 years old here, and
so those pictures that you showed of your father are just among the very few that you have of him, and you have all the pictures that your sister had also?
Yes, I found these pictures in my sister's file, but also I assume when we returned home to Odessa from Tashkent, we had to stop in Moscow, where my father's sister lived, and I think she gave us a few pictures of him.
Tell us Who are those two?
It's about 1945, 46, when we came back to Odessa. On the left, it's winter time, and we were dressed warmer, and so we were actually never had warm enough clothing to wear. I remember in the winter it was very cold, especially our feet were cold, and it's the same. At the same time, another picture had been taken inside our apartment. It's my sister on the left, and the one who wears glasses.
Galena, we have just about come to the end of tape 1, so we will continue with your description of the few remaining artifacts that you brought with us when we resume the tape after a short break. Thank you so much for what you've told us so far.
Thank you.
This is the continuation of Galena Segal's testimony. We were showing some photographs before, and we have a few documents that we would like to discuss. Galena, we're going to have you in just a moment after we get the document into focus. Have you tell us what this document is, if you will. Can you tell us what it is?
This is an original death certificate. My father, Lev Segal. In 1963, I applied for repeal of his accusations, and they sent me this certificate. It says that he died in 1941 from pneumonia, and there is no place indicated where he died. So, and everybody knew that this is just a false paper. This didn't mean that he died from pneumonia. Actually, he was killed.
All right. And when did you decide to do this?
In 1963, I heard people applying for repeal in Russian. It's called rehabilitatsiya. It means to restore his name and to repeal all these accusations. So in this paper, they state that the file of Lev Segal, Lev Yakovlevich, has been closed because all accusation hadn't been proven. So it means that he is not guilty of anything.
So this is the document that we have now on camera indicates that he was not guilty.
Yes.
And
exactly. And it was the decision of Odessa Regional Court, and signed by the judge named Kessler.
And are you planning to try to get this translated?
I will translate both these documents into English to accompany these original documents, which I want to donate to the Museum of Holocaust.
All right. Now, this concludes our interview, and I wanted to ask you if there was anything that you didn't mention during the course of our interview on the first tape, or anything that you would like to add at this time.
I would like to add that in Los Angeles and Orange County, there are many people of my age and older who went through similar life, and some of them were in camps and ghettos, but not that they are afraid to testify. They just don't want to to face their past. It's a very painful past, and it makes them depressed. Not of them realize that speaking out, they would help themselves. And I would like to find more people who would like to testify for this ADL project to get more information from the Russian. And as I continue to do my work as an interpreter of Russian stories, I translated the stories by the Russian writers into English, and all exclusively on the Holocaust theme. And I want to publish these stories eventually, that American readers otherwise won't be able to read them. This is my goal, and I will keep doing it.
Well, that's a wonderful endeavor that you're attempting on your part, and it certainly is necessary. On behalf of the Holocaust Oral History Project of the Orange County Anti-Defamation League, again, thank you so very, very, very much for your testimony. We sincerely appreciate your time and effort. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to say it has been a real honor for me, and it was a rare occasion, and it's one of the highest moments in my life that I was able to bring out my past and share it with American viewers.
Thank you.